This is Amazing Cultivation Simulator. The cultivation in the title is not referring to agriculture. This is not a sort of farming life sim, in the vein of like your Stardew Valleys or your Harvest Moons. This is actually more like a sort of colony sim, something like RimWorld or Dwarf Fortress. They're very clear influences in how all the mechanics work, and the cultivation in the title is actually referring to a very, very old and honestly kind of confusing mythological concept. You've actually probably come across some form or branch or something of this concept before and never actually known it because it's very old and is ingrained in a lot of Asian religious tradition, going back quite a long way. Its origins are in, I believe, Taoism and also Buddhism, but you can see variants of this all over the place. In fact, if you've ever watched, say, Avatar: The Last Airbender, and you remember a character named Guru Patik, who talked about opening chakras and letting go of all of your worldly possessions to sort of become one with the universe, that's basically a variant of this idea. And if you've ever heard of something like, say, the self-mummified monks of Buddhism, the guys that are like super hardcore and eat nothing but pine needles for a while and mummify themselves, and you've ever played something like Zelda Breath of the Wild, where the Sheikah monks in the trials are influenced by those guys, then you've also run into some form of this before. Cultivation is, to put it like overly simply, basically the concept that you can transcend your earthly body in some way and reach enlightenment even after death, and effectively have the chi, the energies of the world around you, form this sort of embryo, is the word they tend to use, in your body, which you will then cultivate by training yourself, eating the correct foods, taking care of your body in the right way, being in the correct environments that are charged with the right energies, all that sorts of stuff. It is a really interesting mythological concept that I actually recommend people read into because it's genuinely fascinating and it goes back a very long time. And the idea is eventually, through application of these laws, these techniques, these sort of paths that you put yourself down, you will reach some form of enlightenment and even become as strong as something like a demigod. And I believe there are even, I think, like 7 or 8, if I recall correctly, actual gods in the ancient Chinese pantheons that even have modern temples and things to them that were said to be these cultivators in ancient times that were once human. So yeah, this concept goes back a long ways, and like I said, that's a vast oversimplification of how it actually was said to work. It's very old and very confusing, but that is what this game is about. You are a sect of just a couple of survivors from a destroyed sect of cultivators, and it is your job to go through the motions to form a new sect, sort of revive the old one, get more people on your side, more and more disciples, and cultivate yourselves to reach enlightenment while making this sort of area that you start in basically like a spiritual center. And that's where the sort of RimWorld and Dwarf Fortress comparisons come in. You are building a colony, and in this case, the various pieces of the environment have a lot of importance because this actually adheres in classic style to the old version of feng shui, so you actually have to worry about planning ahead quite a bit. So if you're looking at the buildings in the background and thinking, wow, that looks kind of inefficient, well, there are 2 reasons for that. One is because I'm still very much learning. This is very early on in the game. Usually I like to get about halfway or more through a game before I actually make a video about it, usually more towards the end. But because of the just huge scale and complexity of this, I am showing more of my early attempts. And as anyone who's ever played something like RimWorld will know, your first colony is never your best. There's a lot that you have to learn, and the first couple of tries will never be the ones that really become huge and successful. It will take a little bit longer than that, so I'm still learning a lot. But 2, that's because you actually need to adhere to the tenets of feng shui to get the best bonuses and things. This whole feng shui system actually affects everything in the game. It's extremely important. So to get the best bonuses and the best moods and the best chances for things in the later game, you actually really need to put a lot of effort into adhering to it. So things like all of those bedrooms in feng shui are supposed to face south. So all of the doors in your bedrooms need to be on the south side. So they all have to be facing that way. That's just how it works. You don't have to build them that way, but you really should to get everyone's mood up the best and to get the best chances for success in later adventures as things get more and more difficult. And production buildings, where you actually go to forge things and make clothes and all that stuff, should face east, which is why the doors on the east side of that kitchen should face west and all that sort of thing. So, and luckily, if you're not really familiar with all these concepts, the game has a really helpful in-game guide that actually tells you all of this, so it doesn't expect you to just magically know all of this, because I definitely didn't. And you can look through that guide guide, then it will tell you all that you need to know about how these things work and how the mythology acts and what you need to adhere to actually help you. But this is definitely, as with RimWorld, Dwarf Fortress, etc., the kind of thing that you will take multiple games to actually learn the ropes. There is a very good set of tutorials in the game, and I recommend you play all of them if you can, because they're really good and they're very helpful, and the game is really, really complicated. So playing as many of them as possible before you actually start your first colony will give you a better chance at establishing at least a relatively successful sect at first, and then as you play the game and get dozens and more of hours into it, you will figure more of the systems out and become more successful in future attempts. The really different thing about this game, besides its mythological concepts from something like RimWorld, is that in traditional like colony sim style, the complexity of the game, the depth where a lot of that is in the grander scale, the sort of logistics side of things. You know, making sure everyone's fed, making sure everyone has proper housing, making sure your production lines are working efficiently, all that stuff. It is a game of scale and of scaling up efficiently and trying to manage the larger picture of things effectively. That's where a lot of the depth comes in. Whereas in this, it's kind of the opposite. There is definitely a scale to it, and in fact, it even gets a little bit 4X strategy-ish later, where you can expand to other territories and have diplomatic relations with other leaders, and even establish branches of your sect once you get enough disciples to send to other places and expand your territory. But besides the obvious things of scale and production and food and housing and all that, most of the depth of this game is actually placed in the micromanagement of it and in the individual people themselves. So they have a lot more depth than your average sort of colonists from games like this tend to. They all have their own stats, their own skills with experience that can grow as they repeat those skills. They all have their own wishes and goals and relations with other people. They have little moods that you have to contend with and make sure to try and keep them in a good mood. And then comes the actual cultivation aspect, the main focus of the game, and definitely its most complicated set of mechanics. So everyone starts out as an outer disciple, basically meaning they have not begun this path yet, and they're just sort of beginning. And every day they will train themselves, do some martial arts and stuff outside, and this is called foundation training, and it gives them these points that add up to 25,000, and at 25,000 they can be promoted to actually follow a law, at which point they become an inner disciple and gain all sorts of powers and things, and that's really the main early goal, is to get as many inner disciples as possible. If an outer disciple does not train their bodies at least once a day, then they will lose 1,000 points for every day they slack off, so you need to keep them on a good schedule between work and eating and sleeping in order to actually give them some time to train themselves and eventually attain this status. Once they get to that 25,000 point threshold, you can choose a law for them, and the laws are basically the sort of training paths that they will follow from that point onward to enhance themselves. And there are all sorts of different laws with all sorts of flowery, interesting names that have different focuses. Some of them are more focused on medicine and the making of elixirs. Some of them are more focused on like sword wielding and combat, and others have some other focuses. There are tons of them, each having their own element, which is important for feng shui, because the other aspect of feng shui is the elemental system, which we'll get to in a minute, and each of them having their own sort of growth stats. Since every character has one of those like stat hexagons, or octagons maybe, you will find that different characters are more fit to follow different laws. They can technically follow any law you have unlocked, but the more compatible they are, the closer their stats match the intended stats of that law, the more quickly they'll be able to grow in it, and the more successful their breakthroughs will be later, which is yet another thing we have to get onto in a minute. And this is, like I said, where a lot of the complexity actually comes from, this micromanagement of your individual disciples to make them stronger, to make them follow their laws, and to allow them to be happy inner disciples, which, depending on what their actual law is, can take all sorts of different forms, although there are a couple of important things that all of them need, like, for instance, food, good clothing fitting to the season. There are seasons with different temperatures. The game has a pretty complicated temperature system, and you will need to control the temperature at various locations for things like forging, for storing food. I always make my food storage area out of ice blocks, which keeps it cold so that food will stay good longer, because food will eventually decay after a certain number of days, depending on the temperature around it. And stuff like that. But you also can't make things too hot or too cold, because the people will complain, and if things are really, really cold or really, really hot, then it may actually injure them, and you have to be careful about the temperature of the surrounding areas and all of your storage buildings and things to make sure that people working in them don't get too hot or too cold and will get very unhappy because of that. But eventually, after you choose one of these laws, you will find that things get very complicated for the individual disciples. all sorts of new things start happening at that point. Once you have one inner disciple, you can form your sect officially, and once you get more and more of them, you can make them go on adventures to other areas. The map that you start in isn't the only map that you can actually explore. There are tons of other areas, from wilderness areas to story important ruins to other cities and towns of other sects that you can visit, and you can send people on adventures or to go camping as long as they're an inner disciple to each of these various areas, and either enter the map yourself and explore it by hand and even take stuff from it, although if that stuff it belongs to other people, then they might not like it very much, but you can technically steal stuff if you really want to, and risk the diplomacy hit for doing that. And the camping tends to make sort of random events happen for every couple of days they're camped. These can be like story important things, or the finding of artifacts, or the finding of other sects, disciples, and some diplomacy actions and stuff like that. Like I said, it gets a little bit 4X strategy-ish when you're on the world map. Once you have chosen a law for one of your inner disciples to follow, they will continue training themselves in accordance with what that law says they should do, and you will have to manage their mood by giving them artifacts and proper clothing and other stuff like that, and making sure they're in an environment that fits their law. Their law will have an element. This uses the classical Chinese 5 elements: the wood, earth, water, fire, and metal. And the way that it works is every element has something that it's strong against and something that it's weak against, effectively. The game uses the term begets, as in like wood begets metal, which means metal is sort of strong to wood. And the way that this works effectively with the whole feng shui system is that you have to give them an environment of the element that begets the element of their law, which is really confusing at first, but it becomes more simple once you actually get into it, because it tells you what to do effectively. So if you have someone going down a metal law path, you want to give them a training area that has a metal elemental thing for them to train on, like a bed or a cushion or something for them to sit on and meditate. And then you want the surrounding room to all be wood elemental stuff, because that's the element that leads into metal. So you want like wood walls, wood furniture, and wood decorations and stuff to help give them the best chance of being at peace and of breaking through later. And the whole breakthrough system is because as they train, they will get this stuff called inspiration, which is effectively like an experience gauge. And every law has a pretty significantly large skill tree of stuff that you purchase with this inspiration. They can be all sorts of things, from just passive upgrades to their mood to more complicated stuff like extra recipes for new talismans or new types of artifacts to create, new medicines, depending on the law you're following. They all have different sort of like blueprints and recipes to learn in the skill tree, and also other miracles and spells for them to perform that can be all sorts of things, like improving the mood of everyone around them, or making them recall painful memories and sort of berserk themselves to make themselves really strong in combat for a little while, but sort of burns them out after a bit and they need to go rest afterwards. Purchasing stuff with inspiration on the skill tree also gives them a stat called attainment, and the higher their attainment is, the more expensive future skill tree purchases are. So you can't actually purchase every single thing on the skill tree, because it will just get way too expensive to do so. You will have to sort of plan your route as to what areas of the tree you want them to focus on. There's no way that you can actually get any individual disciple to get every single thing. You have to sort of choose, which is kind of neat, actually. I always appreciate like mutually exclusive skill choices like that, so making it to where you can't just have everyone do everything all the time makes it a lot more interesting to manage them to work well together. And eventually, as they train themselves through these laws, they will reach a limit. And the limit is represented very much like sort of the chakras that I made an example of earlier. There's sort of some sort of bodily limit that they cannot surpass, and they will no longer be able to get better at their law until they break through. And to break through is something that you have to have them do deliberately. They won't do it automatically. And they will need to be in an environment that fits their law to have a higher chance of breaking through successfully. A failed breakthrough will give them an experience bonus to make the next breakthrough more likely to occur. So then this stacks, so every time they fail, they'll be more and more likely to succeed the next time until eventually they do it. Although different laws have different penalties for failing a breakthrough, some of which can actually be permanent injuries and other afflictions to your characters. So you have to be careful about which laws you're breaking through and what your chances are. And this is where a lot of that earlier talk of like feng shui comes in, because the better the feng shui in an area is, the more likely these breakthroughs are to succeed, and the more likely your characters are to avoid injury and continue developing themselves to get more powerful. This is why it's so important early on in the game to plan your sect and lay all your buildings out very efficiently, so that when it comes time to start breaking through some of your inner disciples to attain new levels of power, you will actually be able to do it more reliably and without as much difficulty. And this that I've all explained so far sounds like a lot, but it's really just scratching the surface of the game. There is even more to it. You can spend chi to turn pretty much anything, even something like a piece of meat or a sword or whatever, into an artifact that will help your inner disciples in combat and also improve their stats and just make them generally happier when they're equipped. You can draw talismans. You actually have to physically draw the talisman, as you probably saw in the footage earlier. You have to use your mouse and draw the shape, which is really cool. And these talismans have all sorts of powerful passive benefits and can be equipped by just about anyone, although only inner disciples can draw them. You can even freehand draw a talisman if you have memorized one of the patterns and you don't have the recipe for it. You can actually draw the pattern by hand and have it create a fake talisman of that type. It will have the same bonuses as if it were the real thing, just not as powerful. And then you get into some later game stuff like tribulations, finding and training pets to make sure they do the right thing. The game gets a little bit black and white in that regard in terms of making your pets do the right thing and reinforcing positive behaviors. You can suppress and explore spirit caves with proper feng shui, and there are mythical beasts like flood dragons and other kinds of dragons and ancient beings in there, almost deity-like, that you can either suppress or even fight, although you have to be very powerful and have a large, powerful sect to stand any chance of fighting those things. Of course, there's the diplomacy with other sects and trading with them, and you can even have traders visit your colony, and you can even kill the traders if you want to and get everything they're carrying, although if you do that, you will never get any other traders again. Who knows why? So that's not something that I recommend actually doing. And yeah, the game is just extremely depthy. The depth is placed a little bit differently than how something like RimWorld or Dwarf Fortress, other games of this genre, work. Less on the grand scale and more on the individual micromanagement of your disciples. And it's really interesting. It's really, really neat. I don't think I've played anything quite like this because I enjoy games like Dwarf Fortress, but this is just different in a lot of ways. And it also has probably the closest thing I've ever seen to the Dwarf Fortress-like injury system, where injuries are really specific, where I can say, like, you know, your left upper shin muscle has a severe cut that is reducing your speed by 10% and all that sort of stuff. It's really specific. So that's always really cool to see. I don't see very many games going for anything even close to that sort of depth, so that's cool. And you also have like a complicated healing system with all sorts of different herbs, painkillers, elixirs, and remedies, medicinal pellets and stuff, and people with healing skill that can prevent these injuries from becoming corrupted and reset bones. And you can even have people lose limbs and still live, and it will affect them for the rest of their lives. You can even do things like have inner disciples expend some of their lifespan to create very powerful miracles and spells. You know, you might see something that says it like improves the happiness of everyone in the sect vastly, but it costs like 20 years off of their lifespan if you want. And you can even have medicines and like miracle pills and stuff that increase the lifespan of people. But the really cool thing about the medicines in this game is they have diminishing returns. So if you just keep having someone eating like various herbs and things, they will get less and less and less effective until eventually you're expending like a very rare and expensive resource to do almost nothing because they've had so much of it that it doesn't do much for them anymore. That's a really cool system. And like I said, this is just scratching the surface of the things that I've seen so far. This is the kind of game that you really need to put dozens of hours into before you fully experience everything. It has a really nice generation system for the map so that the map is a bit different every time, and there are even mods built into the game, so you can mod in new map types, new person types, like new races to play as, and new laws to use, and all sorts of stuff like that. So it has a pretty robust set of modding support right from the beginning, which is cool. I definitely recommend this if you're in the mood for a difficult and fascinating, very depthy sort of colony sim like RimWorld, and want something a little bit different. It is a really cool mythological setting, and the actual depth and complexity to the individual disciple management is something that you don't really see ever to this degree, so that's super cool. And if you jump into it, you are liable to see all sorts of stuff that I haven't even mentioned yet, because the game just keeps throwing mechanics at you and just all sorts of complexity. It's a little bit difficult to learn. The tutorials do a good job of getting you started, but you do have a lot of learning to go, just, you know, making some sects of your own and seeing what happens. Although I will say also the game has a really helpful Discord community. I actually learned some stuff just by talking to those guys over there. The Discord will help you with like anything. There is a dedicated questions channel to go to if you have some questions, and there are very helpful, very nice people there that will direct you correctly to help you out in the beginning, so that's cool too. This is Amazing Cultivation Simulator. I'll put the link in the description below this video to the Steam store page so you can check it out yourself. For the price that they're asking for it, there is a load of stuff to learn here, and if you're into games like this will keep you busy for a very long time. Also, it's got a really nice art style and some very relaxing music. It's a pretty chill game despite its high complexity. That's fun to just pop on a podcast or something in the background and play for a while and develop your sect and see what you can find next. So yeah, highly recommended. It's just very different from anything else that's out there, and is in a genre that we don't have very many entries in the first place. So thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.